I would like to continue where we stopped yesterday. We are in the fourth part of the first chapter of our Jerusalem section. The Jerusalem section we saw could be divided into 3 chapters, and the first of those chapters begins in chapter 11, verse 1, when Jesus enters into Jerusalem, when he clears the temple and gives his disciples a lesson in prayer in connection with the fig tree and the lesson they can learn from it. Because he has cleared the temple, the next part saw a controversy where he is questioned about his authority. When he is questioned about his authority, he asks what might seem to be a question, but is actually a rhetorical question. And the rhetorical question is that his authority comes from his baptism, because it was at his baptism that he had that foundational experience of who God is. In the center of this chapter was the parable of the murderous tenants in chapter 12, verses 1 to 12. This parable seems to have been allegorized already in its telling because of the use of the number of servants and slaves who are sent, who possibly represent the prophets, many of whom were treated badly as the servants were also treated badly, and also because of the use of agapetos, that is the beloved son, which Mark has used earlier of Jesus in chapter 1, verse 11 and chapter 9, verse 7. This parable is not explained because those to whom the parable is directed seem to have understood it and want to react violently. The fourth part of this chapter once again concerns controversies or questions in which people try to trap Jesus. The first in chapter 12, verses 13 to 17, is about whether it was lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not. In his response, even though it seems like Jesus is saying to give the emperor what belongs to the emperor, mainly material things or what is due to him, one cannot give to the emperor the human person, because the human person who is made in the image and likeness of God belongs only to God. There are still others who might interpret as give to the emperor what belongs to the emperor. They might say give nothing to the emperor. This is what Jesus is saying, because everything belongs to God. No one has a right to anything on earth. It is all God's. And so therefore, give nothing to the emperor, give everything to God. The next controversy is about the resurrection, which the Sadducees come and raise in chapter 12, verses 18 to 27. Jesus gives a two-pronged response. The first is about the power of God and what will happen in the resurrection. And second, he goes to a text which they would understand and they would accept, namely the text from the Pentateuch or the Torah, that is Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, in which God speaks with Moses as the God who is still the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which means that these patriarchs are alive. So God is not, I was the God of Abraham, but I still continue to be. And the reason why I continue to be is because they are alive. In this third controversy, namely about the first commandment, we notice that the scribe is not being argumentative. The scribe here hears from a distance the arguments which Jesus has given, and so he seems like a genuine seeker. He wants to know for the sake of discussion. And so because Jesus, according to him, possibly seems to have a different worldview, seems to have a different view of things. He wants now to know from Jesus which is the first of all. Now, it is also understandable that when there were 613 commandments, of which they said 248 were positive and they thought pertaining to the parts of the body, 365 are negative, or what are called prohibitions, pertaining to the days of the year. This is the understanding, of course. In a leap year, there are 366 days, but that is not so much the point. The point is that there were 613. So this scribe seems to be asking, out of these 613, which of these is first? And Jesus responds with the words of the Shema, and Mark alone also quotes the Shema. Matthew and Luke will only quote the verse, but Mark also includes Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, when he speaks about the Lord our God, and the Lord is one. Loving God is in a way what follows, you might say. It is part of the same commandment, but Mark alone quotes the first part, that is, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Now, Jesus is asked about the first commandment. And even though he is asked about the first commandment, Jesus would add the second, that is, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this is from Leviticus 19:18, which really did not stand together with Deuteronomy 6:4-5. However, Jesus is not being novel in this, because there were many other rabbis who would also have included these two commandments. What is the novelty here is that the scribe specifically asks for a first commandment, and Jesus includes this. The novelty is not so much in the inclusion of love of neighbor with love of God. The novelty is in when Jesus talks about it, even though he's asked only about the first commandment. And so therefore, very clearly, as far as Jesus is concerned in his response, love of God is not possible without love of neighbor. If one has to love God, then one has to show that love of God in love of neighbor. 1 John 4:20 puts it very, very strongly when John says there in the first letter, chapter 4, verse 20, if someone says, I love God, but cannot love their brother or sister, they are liars. He uses the strong term liars because he goes on to say, how can you say you love God whom you cannot see, and not love your brother or sister whom you can see? So in other words, love is not blind. Love is clear-sighted. There is nothing as clear-sighted as love. The scribe, because he is favorably disposed and because he seems to want to learn, responds not only by repeating so much Jesus' words and some additions, but also he shows that he himself is able to go above by adding much more than whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. So we see our minds go back to the clearing of the temple. And the reason why the temple could be cleared is because burnt offering and sacrifices are not as important as love of neighbor. So true worship is worship which shows the love which one has for God in action. And Jesus appreciates his response as well. Jesus appreciates the addition. Jesus appreciates that this scribe can go beyond. And that is why he says, you're not far from the kingdom of God. And notice, after this, because no one dares to ask him any question, very clearly, basically now, no one will ask, and Jesus himself will ask the next question, and Jesus himself will give the answer. And so, after the first commandment, we come to now a question, because nobody asked the question. Jesus himself will ask the question. So he says, how can the scribes say that the Messiah is son of David? This son of David idea of the Messiah was really a belief which was standard in Jewish theology. It is also mentioned by John, and a number of Old Testament scriptures speak about the fact that the Messiah would be of the lineage of David. This is why in his genealogy in chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, Matthew goes through great pains to show that even though Joseph is the husband of Mary and not the father of Jesus, Jesus is still of the lineage of David. And so the Davidic kingship and the Davidic messiahship was something which was firmly entrenched in Jewish theology. So Jesus says, how is it that the Messiah can be David's son? Now, son might seem to have this inferior understanding. That means the father is greater than the son. So if the Messiah is David's son, it would imply, it would indicate that David is greater than the Messiah, because David is the Messiah's father. And so Jesus puts this right when he talks about David in Psalm 110. Now, this is the way exegesis was done at the time of Jesus. David is regarded as the author of the psalm. Today we know that there were many individuals who would have written these psalms, and we cannot attribute a particular psalm to a particular individual. However, at the time of Jesus, this is how they would regard it. So David is the author of the psalm, and David is singing the psalm. And which psalm does Jesus refer to? David singing 110, Psalm 110, and the first verse. So what does David say there according to this exegesis of Jesus? David is saying, the Lord, by which he means Yahweh, said to my Lord, by which he means the Messiah. Now, if David is singing that the Lord God said to his Lord, who is the Messiah, sit at my right hand. First, the Messiah is sitting at God's right hand, and therefore very clearly the seat of power. Second, if David is calling the Messiah Lord, then how can the Messiah be David's son? So the point which the Lord is making is this, that while it may be true that the Messiah may be of the lineage of David, and in that sense could be regarded as a son of David, the Messiah is much bigger, much greater than even David. Because of the mention of scribes, and the scribes say that this is basically what will happen, that the Messiah is David's son, Mark brings this text about the warning against the scribes. And Mark very clearly realizes that basically the scribes are external show, while it is true that they would have had knowledge, they would have been able to interpret the law, they would have been understanding of the law, yet their interpretation basically would have been to suit them, as we will see already in the next verse. So all the four objects of desire which are mentioned by Jesus are an indication of external show and wanting much more than they really deserve in many cases. And what they would do was they would misinterpret the law, they would give a wrong interpretation, or they would frighten people, and especially if the person was a widow, because the widow would have had no male to protect her. And so, very clearly, when Jesus mentions here they devour widows' houses, he can mean either through excessive fees, which they would charge exorbitant fees, which the widow could do nothing about but pay, or they would take their houses as pledges. A number of reasons are given why they devour. I mean, it could also be a metaphor for cheating people. And of these people who were cheated, especially widows, because Jesus wants to show that they took advantage of the weak, of those who had no one to protect them. And if the widow did not have a son, then even more would she be at the mercy of these who were unscrupulous. The scribes and their external show, their desire for honor, their desire for pomp and glory, is then compared again with the widow. So Mark is using these catchwords. He talked about the scribes, and then he brings an incident about the scribes. He talked about the scribes devouring widows' houses, and now he talks about a widow. This text has often been translated as the widow's mite. And that is true. Mite basically is an old archaic English term for a small contribution. That is the word mite. MIT is also a small insect, but MIT in archaic English would be a small offering which a person makes. The widow's mite. It's a very small offering, insignificant amount, and that's why it's called mite. So this widow, Jesus is watching. Now, already the positions in the Gospel of Mark are important. We might remember that the families stand outside. So outside is not really a position. While it is a physical position, they are not inside, they are outside. It also represents their theological position. Later in chapter 13, we will read Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives, which is opposite the temple. So this word opposite the treasury now also seems to indicate that Jesus is opposite this collection of money. Now notice, money which was collected in the temple was to be used for the upkeep of the temple and therefore required. You did require to collect money. Otherwise, how would you maintain this huge structure? Who would maintain these fantastic precious stones? Who would do the cleaning? Who would do the repairs when something went wrong? So money surely was required. However, what is sometimes the case, and even today we notice that people make this association with giving to God and receiving blessings from God. And so this idea of quid pro quo, this idea of barter exchange, the more you give, the more you will get. Now this is the idea which also was present at the time of Jesus. So Jesus sees that many rich people put in large sums of money. And notice, the reason why he could possibly notice they put in large sums of money was because they were possibly making a show. However, he also notices, and possibly when he saw the widow, he would have possibly paid more attention to check and see what she's going to do. And when the widow comes, she puts in 2 lepta. So basically, lepton is the singular, lepta is the plural, and a lepta, 100 lepta, would equal a denarius. So you can imagine, the woman is putting 2 lepta, and therefore 2 lepta could only buy a handful of flour or could buy a meager meal, a small meal, which only a small person possibly could eat. And therefore, she puts in that. Now, the interpretation which Jesus gives is this. The widow has put in more than all of them, because it is not the quantity or the amount, it is the disposition that matters. As far as the widow was concerned, her disposition was that she wanted to give everything as far as she was concerned. The others would have contributed out of their abundance, but she has contributed out of her poverty. And notice, put everything she had, all she had to live on. In other words, Jesus also, according to some, seems to be taking a dig at the religious establishment. What do I mean? If the widow had been indoctrinated to believe that it was her duty to give, it was a requirement that she gave, that she had to be generous because it was being given to God, then that was a very, very wrong indoctrination. So what Jesus seems to be complaining about is this, that since this widow was trained in this manner, that she had to give to God, this widow now, maybe the fear, maybe the love, maybe whatever the understanding is, she comes and she puts it. So now this poor widow has got nothing to live on. So where is she going to get the food which she needs to eat? What is going to happen to her? Because of the manner in which she has been taught by the religious leaders. While on the one hand, money would be required for maintenance, while on the one hand, money would be required for a number of other reasons in the synagogue and in the temple, it is also the case that sometimes money dominates. And because Jesus realized that this domination had taken such root in the temple, he had to clear the temple, because then you somehow miss the point. So while things are required, we must make sure that we don't exceed our limits and that those requirements don't become absolute. If the requirement becomes absolute, then there is the danger that we might use a variety of means in order to acquire that, in order to get that. And that is what we need to watch for, we need to watch against. So while Jesus is on the surface level commending the widow for her generosity, Jesus is also taking a dig at the religious authorities who have so indoctrinated this widow that now she has become, in a certain sense, a victim of that kind of teaching, and she does what she does because of the teaching. This brings us now to the last part of the first chapter, which is chapter 13, verses 1 to 2. In chapter 11, verses 1 to 11, after Jesus entered Jerusalem, he entered the temple, he went to the temple. Now, in the last part of this particular chapter, the first chapter, Jesus will exit the temple. So he moves from the temple. And now he will never enter the temple again. So this is, in a way, a definitive move as far as Jesus is concerned. And this particular move, as far as Jesus is concerned, is in order that he will be able to now sit opposite the temple. This is the position which Jesus will take. So his position will be opposite the temple. And here we notice at the beginning of chapter 13, he comes out of the temple. And we are not told who, but one of his disciples looks at the marble of the temple, and it is true that the temple was an exceptionally beautiful sight. There were large stones, there were large white buildings, and the temple was not simply one structure, but there were many structures around it. And that's why the disciple will say large buildings, not just one building, but a number of buildings. And the response of Jesus is, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. Now, this is in a way a prediction of the destruction of the temple, and later in chapter 14, verses 55 to 65, when he is before the Sanhedrin, there will be the false accusation that he said he would break down this temple which was built with hands and build another not built with hands. He never says that, as a matter of fact. In the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 13 following, there is where he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. But he never speaks about the destruction of the temple when he clears the temple in the Synoptic Gospels. And there, John will remind us that he was speaking of the temple that was his body. Here, even though Jesus speaks about the destruction of the temple, he does not speak about the fact that he will destroy the temple. But it is likely that the reason for Mark bringing it up is because Jesus had mentioned here in chapter 13, verse 2, namely, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another. All will be thrown down. So this is possibly what Mark means when later on an allegation will be made that Jesus talked about the destruction of the temple. And so now we come to the second chapter of our Jerusalem section, which is termed as the Eschatological Discourse. The English word eschatological comes from the Greek eschaton, which means the last things, the things of the afterlife. Matthew has 2 whole chapters as his eschatological discourse, chapters 24 and 25. Luke has 1 like Mark, and so Luke's eschatological discourse in chapter 22 is as short as that as in Mark. In Matthew, the parable of the talents, the parable of the 5 wise and 5 foolish virgins is found there. The parable of the separation of the sheep from the goats is found in that eschatological discourse because it deals with the afterlife. What is going to happen? How are we going to be judged? Mark has a parable, but not really what you would consider a parable, only toward the end of this eschatological discourse. So it begins, you might say, after the introduction, which can be seen already in chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. So even though chapter 13, verses 1 and 2 can be seen as the conclusion of the first chapter, where Jesus now exits the temple definitively, it can also be seen as an introduction to the sermon or to the eschatological discourse in the Gospel of Mark. And so in chapter 13, verse 3, Mark gives us the setting for this discourse. And what is the setting? The setting is on the Mount of Olives. So he's sitting now on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives here would indicate 2 things. First, that it is a mountain, and so a theological topos, some important thing is going to take place. Mountains were considered close to God who is up in the heavens. And Mark mentioned very specifically that he sits on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. By this, he indicates the theological position of Jesus opposite the temple. So now, like he was opposite the treasury, here he's not merely opposite the treasury, he's opposite the temple. If 3 disciples were mentioned 3 times, here, for the first time, there are 4 disciples: Peter, James, John, and Andrew. So Andrew is included, and this is the group we might remember who were called first by Jesus: Simon and Andrew, James and John. So these come and ask him privately. And they ask him privately, but 2 questions. What are the 2 questions which they ask him? The questions are basically, when will this be? You just told us not one stone will be left upon another, all will be thrown down. So we are asking you, when will not one stone be left upon another? When will everything be thrown down? First question. And the second question they ask is, what will be the sign? Can you tell us the sign that these things will be accomplished? Now notice, someone might say, but are they not like the Pharisees asking for a sign? I would say yes and no. The Pharisees in Mark chapter 8, verses 11 and 13 were asking a sign of Jesus and his authentication. They were asking him for his credentials. They were asking him to prove that he was on God's side. They were asking him to prove that he had the authority to do what he was doing. This sign is different, even though, as we shall see later on, Jesus will talk about the signs and those things which are not signs. So here, the sign which they ask is not about Jesus and his authority and his credentials. They're asking about what Jesus has said, that not one stone will be left upon another. And the reason why they are asking for a sign is possibly because they want to prepare. We shall see later on, Jesus will tell them that the best way to prepare, no matter when the sign might be, is to remain in the present moment. If one is in the present moment, if one is doing what one is required to do at any given time, then there is absolutely no fear. Then there is absolutely no reason to know when the time will come, because one is in the present. And being in the present moment means to be doing what one is doing when one is supposed to. Supposing now, as a seminarian, as a student of first year theology, you are meant to be in class. But for whatever reason, you are showing that you're in class, at least according to Zoom, but you have gone for a walk. Now, you are not doing what you are meant to do. You might say, I have attended class. No, you're meant to attend class now, and that's all. And that's all. So this is what he will say later on towards the end. So here, it is Peter, James, John, and Andrew. For the first time, Andrew is included in the group of 3 who asked the 2 questions about when this will be and what will be the sign. In his response, Jesus answers in an elaborate manner. And the elaborate manner in which Jesus answers is, first, he answers the second question. And then he answers later the first question. Namely, the first question was, when will this be? And Jesus is explicit. Jesus is unambiguous. Jesus is clear. No one knows. So as far as Jesus is concerned, because no one knows, then how will one respond? And here he gives what is known as a parable. We saw earlier on the fig tree was in leaf. From far away it seemed that there would be fruit. Now the lesson is a little different. The lesson is about reading the signs of the times. What is the parable that we are called to learn about the fig tree, about when the time will come? Nature is nature, and nature behaves as nature has to do. If there is one thing about nature, is that it is present. And that's why Jesus can point to nature as learning from nature. What do we learn from the fig tree? When the branch of the fig tree becomes tender, and when it puts forth its leaves, we know now summer is near, basically. So we can interpret that summer is coming from the manner in which the trees flower or do not flower, from the manner in which the birds migrate or don't migrate. From looking around us, we can figure about the seasons. Later, he gives another parable, namely about being on guard at all times. Namely, a person who owns a lot of property is going on a journey. And even as the person goes, he leaves each person, each of his servants, each of his slaves in charge of something. And the doorkeeper to the home, he commands him, be on watch. That is the second parable. The first parable, reading the signs of the time. The second parable is about when the owner of the house allows a lot of leeway and says, you do what you have to do. I'm not going to watch you. You simply do what you have to do. I'm leaving you all in charge of your own jobs. And then he comes back. However, there is no knowing when he will come. And Jesus, to indicate and to specify that, gives 4 time references: evening, midnight, cockcrow, or dawn. So by specifying these 4 times, Jesus is saying very clearly what we see as the center of this sandwich construction, where Jesus says very, very clearly in chapter 13, verses 30 to 32, but about that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So who knows about that hour? The angels do not know. The Son does not know. Only the Father knows.